All right, we're going to move on to this empty tomb. The empty tomb is interesting because it is really the evidence for it is great, even though it's not accepted by all historians. But more importantly, it is like really how you put it. It's just an important little point to have. So, like, if someone tells you, like, oh, this guy, the people claimed he was resurrected, it's like, well, is his tomb known to be empty? Do we have an empty tomb for this guy? Do we have a missing body? Because we do have one for Jesus. So, like, a lot of times people claim that about someone, and then it's like, well, here's his body. You know, like, the tomb's not empty. You know? So, like, the empty tomb is also important in terms of theology and our idea of... Some people in the past have interpreted the Bible as saying that Jesus rose from the dead as a ghost, or the whole story is a metaphor. You know, I've heard that there's a point that liberal theologians, like in the 1800s, they would say that Jesus never existed, and the whole story of the resurrection is a metaphor for how God forgives us and loves us. Well, the problem with that is, like, Jesus existed, Jesus was crucified, and the tomb was empty. So, like, even if you want to say Jesus came back as a ghost, and you want to take that liberal theology route, the problem is there was an empty tomb. So the empty tomb, I'm just trying to give you an example. Or like if somebody says, well, maybe the disciples hallucinated the resurrection. It's like, well, that doesn't explain the empty tomb. You know, so the empty tomb is just, it's an important little thing to have, and the proof for it's pretty straightforward. So sometimes, like if I'm making a case for some people that we have historical evidence for, you know, that Christianity's true, and we only have a short amount of time, sometimes the easiest thing to do is just make a case for the empty tomb, and they can say, okay, that tomb was empty, and then that kind of like proves a lot, you know. All right, so if you look at Matthew 28, let's go to Matthew 28. Just click Matthew 29, which doesn't exist. All right, Matthew 28. All right, and we have, let's see. We also need to look at chapter 27, I think. All right, so Jesus is crucified. All right, he dies. We have burial. All right, Matthew 27, starting in verse 62, it says, this is Matthew, this is a Christian source. It says, the next day, the one after the preparation for the Sabbath. I guess, it might be the Passover. It says, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver, referring to Jesus, said, after 3 days I will rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and tell people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. Take a guard, Pilate answered. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure by putting a seal on a stone and posting the guard. Okay. And then it says, alright, so the women discover the empty tomb. And then we have, the guard's report here. It's titled in this little Bible. Matthew 28:11, it says, while the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, you are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, because their lives would have been on the line for failing to do their duty to guard a tomb, which seems weird to guard a tomb. Anyway, if this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Alright, so if you remember the principle, the criterion of embarrassment, given what we know of Matthew's point of view, it's very embarrassing for him to, say, everybody was saying that the disciples came and stole the body and are going around lying saying that he came back from the dead. Okay, because the only witnesses to the resurrection are the followers of Jesus and Paul. So and James, but so only certain people witnessed the resurrection. So other people might have said, I don't know if he really resurrected, because I don't trust you guys. Y'all the only ones who saw him. Maybe y'all came and stole his body and are lying to everybody, to get followers for yourself. Maybe people donate money to you, and that's all you're doing. Okay. Given Matthew's point of view, he would never make up a story about the disciples stealing the body. He wouldn't make up that story and put it in there. So, people really were saying that. Okay. The Jews really were saying the disciples came and stole the body. But then on top of that, given the point of view of the enemies of Jesus, the Jewish enemies of Jesus, they would never make up a story about an empty tomb. Because if they want to say that the resurrection is a lie, they could just get Jesus' body and say, here he is. Now, let's say that his body was lost or something like that. Or let's say that the apostles did steal the body. Why not just get some other body and tell everybody that this is Jesus' body? It's clear from the from the Gospels, that not everybody knew how Jesus looked, and it would have been a lie, if the Pharisees and the chief priests danced around a body of some other dead guy and said it was Jesus. But let's face facts. That still would have persuaded a lot of people that Christianity wasn't true. Christians would have said, there would have been some Christians who would have held strong and said, that's not really him. But it would have been your word versus theirs. You stood nothing to lose, and you had some stuff to gain by it. And given the enemies of Christianity that come along later, they would have benefited from this story saying, they lied about Jesus being dead because they went and got his body out of the tomb and showed everyone. That never happened. Because if that had happened, then they would not have said, the disciples stole the body. When they say, since the chief priests and the Jews really were saying that the disciples stole the body, then entailed in that is that it was well known that the tomb was empty. It wasn't just, the grave was in such a place where everybody knew it was empty. You couldn't hide it. Okay, so that means that we're going back to a source where everybody knew what really happened, and they couldn't parade around a fake body through the streets of Jerusalem. So what we get is good evidence that the tomb was empty. Okay? There's additional evidence here, and it's what was in between the two things we read about the women discovering the tomb. All of the Gospels independently attest to the women discovering the empty tomb. So, later Christian legends, or even if the disciples stole the body, they would not make up a story about the women discovering the empty tomb. So let's say that the disciples did steal the body. Okay? Well, still, somebody discovered that tomb was empty first. The story of the discovery of the empty tomb is not made up, because they would never have made up a story where women were the ones that discovered that. You just wouldn't do that. from what we know of what it was like to be a woman in that era and that time. So we have the Pirkei Avot, which dates 200 BC to 200 AD, so it stretches over a long period of time. But it is a collection of Jewish oral traditions, and it's like Rabbi so-and-so used to say, and things were handed down word of mouth till they got written in the Pirkei Avot. And what the belief was in that time was that Moses got the laws from God that he put in the Old Testament in the books of the law, in the books of Moses, but he didn't. There were other things that he just heard orally, and he never wrote down. He just told Jewish leaders, and that got handed down generation to generation, word of mouth, till it got written in the Pirkei Avot. So the Pirkei Avot was considered as good as the law of God, and as the Old Testament. Their traditions. It's one of the things that Jesus is arguing about. They have a tradition of hand washing, ceremonial hand washing, and his disciples didn't follow it. And he says, you have a fine way of rejecting the law of God for the sake of your traditions. For the law of Moses says that you're supposed to honor your father and mother. In other words, take care of your parents in their old age. But you say that, based on your traditions, that if somebody gives all their money to the temple, they don't have to take care of their parents. Or the money that would have taken care of their parents goes to the temple, not all their money. And you nullify the word of God by your traditions. So Jesus argues against the Pirkei Avot here. But the Pirkei Avot says that it is a sin to teach women the law of God, because you're essentially going to be teaching them to become sluts and prostitutes, because then they'll become teachers, and women shouldn't have positions like that where they're in authority over other people, because they'll just become sluts and prostitutes. That's what it says in the Pirkei Avot. Okay, so this is what they believed in that period was the law of God. It was the general prevailing view. We've got more evidence that's to come. It also says that if you talk with a woman too long, you're in danger of going to hell. Okay? In general, women were not to be trusted in this era. Josephus, writing in 94 AD in the Antiquities of the Jews, he says, let not a single witness be credited, but 3 or 2 at the least. Alright, so what he's saying is someone can't be found guilty on the basis of one witness. You need 2 or 3 witnesses. You need multiple independent attestation. And then he says, and their testimony must be confirmed by their good lives. But let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity of the boldness of their sex. In other words, they just say stuff without really worrying about what they say. Nor let servants be admitted to give testimony on the account of the ignobility of their soul. Okay, so then the poor servants. Since it is probable that they may not speak truth, either out of the hope of gain or the fear of punishment. So, there you go. Women are so untrustworthy that their testimony doesn't count in court. This is backed up by what it says in the Bible, the Gospel of Luke, written in 85 AD. Some may claim that it was edited up to 110. That's not super relevant for us. But Luke 24, starting in verse 9, the women come back from the tomb. It says, when they come back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11, the male disciples, and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. In other words, women talk is nonsense, it's not reliable, it's not trustworthy, it's not worth listening to. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. He thought something was going on. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. He still didn't take the women seriously on their claim that they saw Jesus, Jesus appeared to them. In other words, the most important event in all of history, the first witnesses are all women. In this context, where women are supposed to be untrustworthy. So the point is, later Christian legends, and we'll talk about legends later as we, or a hoax story of an empty tomb. Maybe the disciples stole the body and hoaxed about the resurrection. We have other evidence that they didn't do that, but for the sake of this video, let's say they did that. Well, they at least didn't hoax the empty tomb, because they wouldn't have hoaxed it and then made women, who were considered liars and people you just couldn't take the word of, the discoverers of the empty tomb. And we have 2 sources here for this. Well, 3 really. So that's how the general view of women was in their day. We could have added more sources, but I thought this was sufficient. Because, again, with Luke here saying this, it's not, that they didn't believe the women, that just, there's no much real reason for him to lie about that. They probably didn't, that's just independent attestation of, an example of how women were listened to in that day. So anyway, that is that. We can say that it's more likely than not that the tomb was found empty, and that it's considered historically certain that Jesus existed and was crucified. Born, 4 BC, maybe a little before. Died or baptized in, 26 BC at the age of 32. His death would have been around 37 BC. Oh, okay. Well, no. Before 37 AD. Okay, I got this right. Jesus would have been baptized in 26 BC at the age of 32. And then it's around year 30 that he would have been crucified. So not 37. Well, I don't know how they come up with 37 AD for the crucifixion. Maybe his, I don't know. That's not super important for what we're doing. It's close enough for our purposes. So anyway, there we have it. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for your time.